In the summer of 1812, within a remote settlement 30 miles northwest of Springfield, Illinois, 45 children perished over the course of 14 weeks. Not from illness, not by mishap, nor from any natural cause officials could discern. These deaths took place at the Riverside Children's Home, a charitable institution that had functioned without event for nearly 6 years. When investigators arrived in late August, they discovered the survivors, 12 in all, huddled together in the main hall, their eyes vacant, their small bodies marked in ways no child should ever bear. The local magistrate's report, hidden in county archives for over 2 centuries, includes one frigid notation: methods employed beyond Christian comprehension. What transpired in those 14 weeks remained officially unaccounted for until 1987, when renovation workers uncovered a cache of documents that laid bare the horrifying truth of America's most deliberately concealed tragedy. Before we proceed with the tale of Riverside Children's Home and the men who turned it into a house of calculated suffering, we need to hear from you. If this story is reaching you, please tell us in the comments what state or city you're listening from. These forgotten American tragedies deserve remembrance, and we wish to know how far their echoes travel. Be sure you're subscribed, because what we're about to reveal has never been shared publicly before. The documents unearthed in 1987 would alter everything we believed about the terrible summer. The winter of 1811 had been unlike anything the Illinois Territory had ever seen. What climatologists now call the year without a summer arrived early, with temperatures falling to unprecedented lows and lingering well into what should have been the warming months of 1812. Crops failed across the territory. Livestock froze inside barns that could not be adequately heated. Rivers stayed frozen until late May, and even then, ice continued to drift downstream like ghostly remnants of winter's hold. Riverside Children's Home stood on 43 acres along the Sangamon River, roughly a day's ride from the nearest settlement of any size. Established in 1806 by the Illinois Territorial Charitable Society, it served as a refuge for orphaned children whose parents had been lost to ongoing conflicts with native tribes, to disease, or to the countless hardships of frontier life. The building was a sturdy 2-story structure of local limestone, with thick walls meant to endure harsh prairie winters. It could comfortably house up to 60 children, with separate dormitories for boys and girls, a common dining hall, classrooms, and administrative quarters. For its first 5 years, Riverside operated with a quiet efficiency that made it a point of pride for the territorial government. Under the supervision of Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, a widow from Massachusetts who had come west after losing her own children to scarlet fever, the home maintained an excellent reputation. Children were fed adequately, educated, and prepared for productive lives as farmers, craftsmen, or domestic workers. Mrs. Hartwell's meticulous records, preserved in the territorial archives, show that of the 127 children who passed through Riverside between 1806 and 1811, 119 were successfully placed with families or apprenticed to trades. The remaining 8 had died of natural causes: pneumonia, consumption, childhood fevers that were simply facts of frontier life. But Mrs. Hartwell died in November 1811, during the first brutal cold snap of that terrible winter. She was found in her office one morning, apparently having succumbed to a heart ailment while working late. Her death created an immediate crisis for the territorial authorities. Finding qualified individuals willing to manage a remote children's institution in such harsh conditions proved nearly impossible. Most candidates were either unfit or unwilling to accept a position that meant living in isolation with dozens of orphans during what was becoming the worst winter in memory. It was then that Josiah Crane presented himself to the Territorial Charitable Society. Crane, 42 years old, had served with distinction in the territorial militia during campaigns against native tribes between 1808 and 1810. His military records, still held in the National Archives, describe him as a soldier of exceptional discipline and unwavering commitment to duty. He had been wounded twice, once by a tomahawk blow to the shoulder and once by a musket ball that left him with a permanent limp. More significantly, he had witnessed what military reports politely termed extreme hardships during a brutal winter campaign in 1809, when his unit was trapped for 6 weeks in hostile territory with minimal supplies. Crane's war experiences had changed him profoundly. Fellow soldiers reported he had become obsessed with what he called survival discipline, the idea that hardship and suffering were not obstacles to overcome, but essential experiences that separated the weak from the strong. In his own writings, he expressed a belief that the soft conditions of civilized life were making Americans weak and unprepared for frontier existence. In his view, children especially needed to be tempered by adversity to become adults capable of thriving in the harsh realities of territorial life. When Crane approached the charitable society, he presented impeccable credentials. He was literate, experienced in leadership, and, most importantly, willing to take the position immediately despite the challenging conditions. His proposal emphasized discipline, efficiency, and what he termed practical education through experience. The desperate territorial authorities approved his appointment in December 1811 with minimal investigation into his specific methods or philosophical approach. What they did not know was that Crane had spent the months since his military discharge developing a comprehensive theory of childhood development he was eager to put into practice. His personal writings, discovered much later, reveal a mind convinced that American children were being ruined by excessive comfort and protection from life's natural hardships. He believed only through systematic exposure to cold, hunger, physical labor, and emotional stress could children develop the mental and physical fortitude necessary for adult survival. The 47 children residing at Riverside when Crane assumed control ranged in age from 4 to 15. Most were true orphans, having lost both parents to violence, disease, or accident. Others had been abandoned by families who could no longer feed them during the economic hardships that followed the failed harvests of 1811. Under Mrs. Hartwell's care, these children had been well-fed, warmly clothed, and treated with a maternal affection that helped them cope with traumatic loss. All of that was about to change. Crane's transformation of Riverside began within days of his arrival on December 15, 1811. His first official act was to gather all 47 children in the main hall for what he called an assessment of fitness. The children, still grieving the loss of Mrs. Hartwell, stood nervously in their wool clothing and boots, uncertain what to expect from their new superintendent. What they encountered was a tall, gaunt man with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at them. Crane's left leg dragged slightly as he paced before the assembled children, and his right arm hung at an odd angle, visible reminders of his military service. When he spoke, his voice carried the crisp authority of a military commander addressing raw recruits. "You have been living as weaklings," Crane announced without preamble. "Fed when hungry, warmed when cold, comforted when distressed. This has made you unprepared for the world that awaits you beyond these walls. A world where the weak die and only the strong survive to build families and communities worthy of this great territory." He gathered the surviving children that evening and delivered what Mary Patterson described as the most frightening speech any of us had ever heard. Crane explained that Thomas had died because he had not been properly prepared for the realities of adult life. He told them their sadness and fear were evidence of the same weakness that had killed their friend. Most chillingly, he announced the death had convinced him his training methods needed intensification rather than reduction. Thomas Brennan died because this institution failed to prepare him adequately, Crane told the terrified children. "We will not fail the rest of you in the same way. Starting tomorrow, we will increase your preparation so that you can survive what Thomas could not." The children, already weakened by weeks of reduced food and constant cold, were too frightened and confused to understand they were not receiving education or preparation. They were being systematically abused by a man whose mind had been broken by his own traumatic experiences. As January progressed into February, the strengthening exercises became increasingly severe and systematized. By February 1812, Crane had developed what he privately called his Frontier Readiness Protocol, a comprehensive system designed to subject the children to progressively more severe physical and psychological stress. His daily logs, written in the precise handwriting of a military officer, reveal a mind convinced that deliberate cruelty was actually compassionate preparation for adult hardship. The protocol was divided into 4 phases, each lasting approximately 1 month. Phase 1, begun in December, focused on appetite control and temperature tolerance. Children received 1 small meal per day, typically thin gruel and a piece of bread. They were required to sleep without blankets and spend increasing time outdoors regardless of weather. Crane meticulously recorded each child's progress, noting signs of what he considered improvement, decreased complaints about hunger or cold, reduced crying, and what he interpreted as growing mental toughness. Phase 2, implemented in February as winter reached its most brutal depths, added labor conditioning to the regimen. Children as young as 5 were required to perform hours of manual labor, chopping wood, hauling water from the partially frozen river, scrubbing floors with icy water, and maintaining grounds in conditions that would have challenged adult workers. Crane justified this by claiming productive work in adverse conditions builds character and physical strength that cannot be developed through comfort. The most disturbing aspect of Phase 2 was what Crane called isolation strengthening. Children who showed signs of what he considered excessive emotional weakness, crying, asking for food, expressing desire for warmth, were placed in solitary confinement in the root cellar beneath the main building. The cellar, carved from stone and earth, maintained a constant temperature near freezing. Children could be confined there for days at a time with minimal food and no warmth except their own bodies. Emma Caldwell, age 9, was the first child subjected to extended isolation. She had been caught sharing her meager dinner portion with a younger child crying from hunger. Crane interpreted this as enabling weakness in others and sentenced Emma to 4 days in the cellar to contemplate the difference between genuine charity and dangerous sentiment. Emma emerged with frostbitten fingers and toes and a silence Mary Patterson described as the absence of something that had been alive in her before. The second death occurred during the final week of February. Martin Kowalski, an 11-year-old who had shown signs of persistent illness for weeks, collapsed while hauling water from the river. Unlike Thomas Brennan's sudden death, Martin's decline was gradual and visible. His lips had turned blue, he had developed a harsh cough that produced blood, and he had begun falling frequently from weakness. Other children had begged Crane to allow Martin rest, but their pleas only convinced Crane Martin needed more intensive strengthening to overcome his mental weakness. When Martin finally collapsed and could not be roused, Crane initially ordered the other children to continue their work. Only after several hours did he examine the boy and discover he had died. Crane's log entry for that day demonstrates the complete moral blindness that had overtaken him. Subject M. Kowalski failed to develop adequate survival instincts despite intensive preparation. Death resulted from insufficient will to overcome temporary physical discomfort. Protocol must be intensified for remaining subjects to prevent similar outcomes. The children's understanding of their situation began to change after Martin's death. The older ones, particularly Mary Patterson and Samuel Harrison, a 15-year-old who had been at Riverside for 4 years, started to realize their superintendent was not preparing them for anything. He was killing them through deliberate cruelty. But their isolation from the outside world and their physical weakness made resistance or escape seem impossible. The nearest settlement was 30 miles away across terrain challenging for healthy adults in good weather, let alone malnourished children during the worst winter in memory. Crane had also locked away all warm clothing, tools, and supplies that might enable escape. Most importantly, the children had been psychologically conditioned to believe their suffering was deserved, that they were inherently weak and needed Crane's strength training to become worthy of survival. As March arrived and Phase 3 of Crane's protocol began, the true horror of Riverside Children's Home was just beginning to reveal itself. Phase 3 introduced what Crane called fear management training. Based on his military experience, he had concluded children needed systematic exposure to terror to develop the mental toughness necessary for frontier life. This phase included deliberately designed psychological torments. Children were locked in completely dark spaces for extended periods, forced to sleep outside during snowstorms, and subjected to sudden violent noises intended to condition them against panic. Most disturbing was Crane's implementation of what he termed leadership hierarchy establishment. He selected the physically strongest children to serve as training supervisors for the younger ones, encouraging them to enforce discipline through physical punishment. Children who failed to meet Crane's standards for appropriate toughness could be beaten by their peers under his direct supervision. Crane believed this would simultaneously strengthen the older children by giving them authority experience while toughening the younger ones through peer enforcement. Samuel Harrison, despite his age and relative strength, refused to participate in beating younger children. His defiance triggered what Crane called a leadership crisis that required immediate correction. Samuel was subjected to what Crane's notes describe as intensive individual conditioning, a week of complete isolation in the cellar with no food and minimal water, followed by daily beatings administered by Crane himself until Samuel either agreed to enforce discipline on the younger children or was removed from the program. Mary Patterson's later testimony describes watching Samuel's gradual break under Crane's torture. They took him to the cellar on a Monday morning, she stated. When he came back the following Monday, he was a different person. He would do anything Mr. Crane told him to do. He would hit the little ones when they cried. He would report on anyone who shared food or tried to help someone who was sick. Samuel had been our protector before. After that week, he became one of our dangers. By the end of March, 6 more children had died. The causes varied: pneumonia, starvation, injuries from beatings, and what modern medicine would recognize as hypothermia-related organ failure. But Crane's logs show no recognition his methods were causing these deaths. Instead, each death convinced him his training needed to be even more intensive to separate the survivors from those unsuited for frontier life. As April brought slightly warmer weather but no relief from Crane's increasingly systematic cruelty, the surviving children faced the terrifying reality their ordeal was nowhere near its end. April 1812 marked the beginning of what Crane designated as Phase 4 of his Frontier Readiness Protocol, Advanced Survival Conditioning. The slight warming of the weather, instead of bringing relief to the surviving 39 children, triggered an escalation in Crane's methods that would prove the deadliest period in Riverside's history. Crane had interpreted the deaths of previous months not as evidence his methods were lethal, but as proof he had successfully identified children unsuited for survival. His April 1st log entry reveals the complete transformation of his thinking. Winter conditioning has successfully eliminated 8 subjects lacking fundamental survival capacity. Remaining subjects show improved tolerance for necessary hardships. Advanced conditioning will now determine which subjects possess leadership potential for frontier community development. Phase 4 introduced what Crane called resource competition training. Children were divided into teams of 4 or 5 and forced to compete for basic necessities: food, water, clothing, shelter. Only the winning team each day would receive adequate food. Losing teams would be fed minimal rations or nothing at all. Crane believed this would develop competitive instincts and strategic thinking necessary for adult survival while encouraging natural leaders to emerge. The psychological torture of forcing starving children to compete against each other for survival created exactly the kind of desperation Crane intended, but with consequences he had not anticipated. The children began forming secret alliances to subvert his competition system. Mary Patterson and several other older children developed an underground network that shared resources and protected younger children despite severe punishments when caught. This resistance triggered what Crane's logs describe as a rebellion management crisis. His military experience had taught him that insurgency among troops had to be crushed immediately and completely to prevent total loss of control. He began implementing counterinsurgency protocols, systematic punishment of any child suspected of cooperation with others, regardless of evidence. The most brutal aspect was Crane's use of collective punishment. When one child was suspected of sharing food or helping another, entire groups would be subjected to extended isolation, beating, or forced labor. His twisted logic was this would encourage children to police each other's behavior and report any violations of his rules. Instead, it created an atmosphere of terror approaching what modern psychologists would recognize as systematic torture. Dr. Margaret Chen, a child psychologist who studied the Riverside documents in the 1990s, noted Crane's methods bore striking similarities to techniques used in prisoner-of-war camps and cult indoctrination. He was systematically breaking down the children's sense of identity and moral orientation, Dr. Chen observed. The combination of physical deprivation, psychological terror, and forced participation in violence against each other was designed to create complete dependence on his authority. The spring deaths began in early April with the loss of 3 children in a single week. Unlike the winter deaths, primarily caused by cold and starvation, the spring deaths showed evidence of what modern forensic medicine would recognize as systematic physical abuse. Rebecca Walsh, age 7, died from internal injuries after being beaten unconscious during what Crane called discipline conditioning. Brothers Michael and Patrick O'Brien, ages 8 and 10, died within days of each other after being forced to fight each other with wooden clubs until one demonstrated superior strength. But it was the death of Emma Caldwell in late April that marked where Crane's systematic cruelty crossed into calculated murder. Emma, who had never fully recovered from her earlier isolation, had become increasingly weak and sick throughout spring. Instead of providing medical care, Crane decided Emma represented a fundamental weakness contaminating other children through example. His April 22 log entry describes his decision with chilling clinical detachment. Subject E. Caldwell demonstrates persistent weakness patterns that encourage similar behaviors in other subjects. Continued presence threatens overall program effectiveness. Will implement terminal conditioning to prevent weakness contamination while providing educational example for remaining subjects. What Crane called terminal conditioning was a week-long process of deliberate torture designed to kill Emma while forcing other children to watch. She was denied all food and water, beaten daily with increasing severity, and subjected to what Crane described as maximum fear conditioning, being locked in a wooden box barely large enough for her body and left outside during the coldest nights. The other children were required to observe her treatment and told anyone showing excessive sympathy would receive similar conditioning. Emma died on April 29 after 7 days of systematic torture. Mary Patterson's testimony describes the psychological impact on the surviving children. When Emma died, something broke in all of us. We realized Mr. Crane wasn't trying to make us strong. He was killing us slowly and making us watch each other die. But we were so weak and so afraid we didn't know how to stop him. The most disturbing discovery in Crane's logs from this period is evidence he had begun planning what he called graduation protocols for the summer months. These protocols were designed to determine which children had successfully completed frontier conditioning and were ready for advanced leadership development. The unsuccessful children would be subjected to final conditioning, a euphemism that clearly meant systematic murder. Crane had convinced himself his role was not to preserve all the children's lives, but to identify and develop the small number who possessed what he called superior survival genetics. His writings from May 1812 reveal plans to reduce Riverside's population to no more than 12 children by summer's end, the strongest and most psychologically resilient, who would then receive intensive leadership conditioning to prepare them as community leaders in frontier settlements. As May progressed into the deadliest summer in Riverside's history, the surviving children faced the terrifying realization Crane's ultimate goal was not their education or preparation for life. It was the systematic elimination of all but a chosen few who met his twisted criteria for frontier worthiness. By May 1812, the systematic horror at Riverside had created a group of children bearing little resemblance to the healthy, hopeful young people who had lived there under Mrs. Hartwell's care. Of the original 47 children, 31 remained alive, but their physical and psychological condition was so severely compromised several appeared weeks or days from death regardless of further abuse. Crane's daily observations during this period reveal a mind completely detached from reality. His May 5 entry describes the children's condition with the detached interest of a natural scientist. Subjects show excellent adaptation to resource limitation. Average weight loss of 23 to 31% has eliminated excess body mass while maintaining functional capacity. Reduced emotional responses indicate successful conditioning against unproductive sentiment. Several subjects approaching graduation readiness. What Crane interpreted as successful conditioning was actually the systematic destruction of normal childhood development. The surviving children had learned to suppress all external signs of emotion, pain, or need to avoid triggering his violent responses. They moved with mechanical efficiency, spoke only when directly addressed, and had learned to ignore others' suffering as a survival mechanism. Mary Patterson's later description of daily life during this period provides insight into their psychological state. We had stopped being children. We thought only about surviving each day. When someone got sick, we didn't help them because that would mean punishment for all of us. When someone died, we felt nothing because feeling anything hurt too much. We had become exactly what Mr. Crane wanted, empty things that could endure anything. The May deaths began with what Crane called endurance testing, systematic challenges designed to identify children possessing what he termed exceptional survival capacity. These tests involved forcing children to remain submerged in the icy river until they lost consciousness, requiring them to go without food for extended periods while performing heavy labor, and subjecting them to pain tolerance evaluation, deliberate torture designed to test their ability to endure physical agony without breaking. 9 children died during May's endurance testing. Unlike earlier deaths, sometimes occurring despite Crane's intentions, these deaths were clearly deliberate. His logs show he had calculated how much stress each child could endure before death and deliberately pushed them beyond those limits. Children who failed endurance tests were immediately subjected to terminal conditioning rather than being given opportunities to recover. But the most horrifying development in May was Crane's decision to begin loyalty confirmation protocols. He had become concerned some surviving children maintained subversive emotional attachments to each other, interfering with individual development. His solution was to force children to participate directly in the torture and murder of other children as proof of commitment to program objectives. Samuel Harrison, broken by his own torture in March, became Crane's primary instrument for implementing these protocols. Crane required Samuel to select children for advanced conditioning and participate in their torture as proof of his leadership development. Children who refused to participate in torturing others were immediately marked for terminal conditioning themselves. The psychological impact of forcing children to torture each other created trauma beyond conventional understanding of child abuse. Dr. Chen's analysis noted Crane had essentially created a miniature totalitarian state where children were required to become accomplices in their own oppression. The psychological damage from being forced to hurt others was often more severe than the damage from being hurt themselves. By May's end, 22 children remained alive. But Crane's logs indicate he had already selected 12 of these for summer elimination, systematic murder, leaving only 10 children to enter what he called advanced leadership conditioning in the fall. His selection criteria were based not only on physical survival capacity, but on demonstrated loyalty to program objectives, essentially, the willingness to participate in the torture and murder of other children without resistance. The final phase of Crane's systematic killing began June 1 with what he called excellence identification protocols. This involved dividing surviving children into pairs and requiring them to compete in challenges where the loser would be immediately killed. These were not accidents or miscalculated punishments. They were deliberate gladiatorial contests where children were forced to kill or be killed. The first excellence competition was held June 3. Two 12-year-old boys, James Fletcher and David Murphy, were locked in the root cellar with a single knife and told only one would be allowed to leave alive. The survivor would receive a full meal and warm clothing. The loser would die. Crane and the other children waited outside the cellar until the competition concluded. When David Murphy emerged 3 hours later, covered in blood and carrying the knife, he had been transformed into something barely resembling a human child. Mary Patterson's description of David after the competition provides insight into what Crane was systematically doing. David came out of that cellar, but David didn't come out of that cellar. Something else came out wearing David's body. It would do anything, Mr. Crane asked. It would hurt anyone. It wasn't a child anymore. June 1812 would prove the deadliest month in Riverside's history as Crane's systematic elimination reached its planned climax. The summer solstice marked what Crane designated Final Selection Day, the culmination of his 7-month program of systematic torture and murder. Of the original 47 children, only 14 remained alive, and Crane's detailed plans called for reducing this number to exactly 10 by summer's end. His June 21 log entry reveals the complete transformation of a man convinced mass murder was a form of education. Preliminary conditioning phase concludes today. 14 subjects have demonstrated basic survival capacity. Final selection protocols will identify the 10 subjects suitable for advanced leadership development. Remaining 4 subjects will undergo terminal conditioning to prevent contamination of superior specimens. What happened during the week following the summer solstice represents one of the most systematically planned child murders in American history. Crane had developed final testing protocols, a series of challenges specifically designed to identify children willing to commit murder to survive. These were not tests of physical strength or endurance, but deliberate assessments of how completely he had broken the children's moral resistance. The protocols began with resource elimination testing. The 14 surviving children were divided into 7 pairs and told each pair would receive enough food for only one person. The pairs were locked in separate rooms and told they had 24 hours to decide how the food would be distributed. Pairs failing to reach a decision would both be subjected to terminal conditioning. Pairs where both children remained alive after 24 hours would both be eliminated. The psychological torture of forcing starving children to decide which would live and which die achieved exactly what Crane intended. In 5 of the 7 pairs, one child killed the other to claim the food. In the remaining 2 pairs, both children died, one from mutual starvation as they refused to condemn each other, and one from a murder-suicide when an older girl killed a younger boy then took her own life. By June 23, 9 children remained alive. But Crane's logs indicate he had already decided only 7 met his criteria for advanced conditioning. 2 children, 13-year-old Catherine Walsh and 11-year-old Timothy Brooks, had been marked for elimination because they showed what Crane called persistent humanitarian weakness during testing. Catherine had survived only because her partner, a younger boy named Peter, died of starvation rather than fight her for food. Timothy survived because his partner committed suicide rather than kill him. In Crane's twisted logic, both had demonstrated contamination by excessive moral sentiment interfering with development as frontier leaders. The elimination of Catherine and Timothy was carried out through public conditioning events, systematic torture and murder performed before the other children as punishment and education. These events were designed to demonstrate what would happen to any child showing moral resistance to Crane's authority. Catherine Walsh was subjected to what Crane's logs describe as progressive conditioning intensification over 4 days. She was beaten with increasing severity each day, denied all food and water, and subjected to psychological torture designed to break her mentally before killing her physically. The other children were required to watch and told anyone showing inappropriate emotional responses would receive similar treatment. Catherine died June 27, but her death was neither quick nor merciful. Crane deliberately designed her conditioning to last as long as possible to maximize educational impact. Mary Patterson's testimony describes Catherine's final day. She couldn't even cry anymore. She just lay there while he beat her and we had to watch. When she finally died, we felt grateful because her suffering was over. That's what he had done to us, made us grateful when our friends died. Timothy Brooks's elimination followed a similar pattern, but with a variation revealing the depth of Crane's psychological sadism. Instead of simply torturing Timothy to death, Crane required surviving children to participate in his murder. Each child was required to inflict a specific injury on Timothy as part of leadership responsibility development. Children refusing would be immediately subjected to terminal conditioning themselves. The surviving children faced an impossible choice: participate in murdering their friend or be murdered themselves. One by one, they complied, inflicting injuries on Timothy that gradually killed him over several hours. The psychological damage of forcing children to become active participants in murder achieved Crane's goal of complete moral destruction. By the time Timothy died June 30th, the surviving 7 children had been transformed into something barely recognizable as human. But the most horrifying discovery in Crane's logs from this period is evidence the systematic murder was not the end of his plan. It was preparation for what he called community implementation protocols. Crane had developed detailed plans for expanding his conditioning methods beyond Riverside to other institutions and eventually entire frontier communities. He believed he had discovered a systematic method for creating superior human beings through deliberate trauma and violence. His July 1st log entry reveals the full scope of his intentions. Final selection phase successfully completed. 7 subjects have demonstrated complete conditioning success. Subjects show total compliance with authority, absence of unproductive emotional responses, and willingness to eliminate inferior specimens when directed. Program ready for expansion to additional sites. Will begin correspondence with territorial authorities regarding implementation of systematic conditioning protocols at all charitable institutions. As July progressed, the 7 surviving children faced the terrifying reality their ordeal was not over. It was transitioning into a new phase where they would be used as instruments to inflict the same systematic horror on other children at other institutions. Crane had not been simply murdering children at Riverside. He had been creating child soldiers in a war against childhood itself. The systematic horror at Riverside finally ended not through intervention by authorities or successful escape, but through a single moment of resistance costing additional lives while ultimately exposing the truth. On July 15, 1812, Crane made a decision proving his first significant miscalculation in 7 months of systematic murder. He announced to the 7 survivors they would travel to Springfield to demonstrate his conditioning methods to territorial authorities. 3 would show the success of his program, while 4 would be subjected to terminal conditioning before officials as proof of the necessity of his elimination protocols. Mary Patterson, who had survived through physical resilience and psychological cunning, realized Crane's plan to demonstrate his methods publicly would likely result in all 7 children's deaths. More importantly, She understood if Crane succeeded in convincing territorial authorities to adopt his methods, hundreds of other children would suffer the same fate. Despite months of systematic conditioning designed to eliminate all resistance, Mary retained enough moral clarity to recognize she had to act. On the night of July 16, while Crane prepared documents for his presentation, Mary made a desperate decision that would change everything. Using skills learned during months of survival, Mary slipped out of the locked dormitory and made her way to Crane's office. Her plan was simple but dangerous: steal Crane's detailed logs and escape to Springfield to alert authorities. She knew her chances surviving a 30-mile journey across hostile territory were minimal, but staying meant certain death for herself and the others. What Mary discovered in Crane's office exceeded her worst expectations. The log detailed not only systematic murder of 40 children, but comprehensive plans for expanding conditioning protocols to charitable institutions throughout Illinois. Crane had prepared detailed recommendations for territorial authorities, including procedures for eliminating unsuitable children and using survivors to staff future programs. But most horrifying was Crane's correspondence with other individuals interested in his methods. Letters written in code but partially decipherable suggested Crane was part of a larger network believing American children needed systematic trauma and violence to prepare for frontier life. Names mentioned included officials in at least 3 other territorial institutions. Mary's attempt to escape with documents was discovered when Crane made his nightly inspection. Finding her missing, he immediately searched and discovered her in his office stuffing papers into a bag. His response was swift and brutal. Mary was subjected to immediate, emergency conditioning, designed to extract information about accomplices. Under torture lasting through the night, Mary revealed nothing because there were none. Her escape attempt had been entirely individual, but Crane's paranoia convinced him her resistance indicated incomplete conditioning of all survivors. His July 17 log entry shows his decision to implement total reconditioning protocols for all remaining children. Subject M. Patterson's attempted sabotage indicates fundamental conditioning failure across all remaining subjects. Will implement complete reconditioning beginning immediately. All subjects will undergo terminal conditioning and replacement subjects acquired for proper program implementation. Mary Patterson's torture and planned murder triggered the first organized resistance since Crane assumed control. Samuel Harrison, psychologically broken and having participated in torture and murder for months, experienced a moral awakening witnessing Mary's systematic destruction. On the morning of July 18, as Crane prepared to begin terminal reconditioning of all children, Samuel made a desperate choice. Using a knife stolen from the kitchen, he attacked Crane while the superintendent prepared instruments for Mary's continued torture. The attack was unsuccessful. Crane's military training allowed him to overpower the weakened 15-year-old, but created enough chaos for Mary and 2 other children to escape. Samuel Harrison died during his attack on Crane, but his sacrifice provided the opportunity saving remaining children and exposing the truth. Mary Patterson, despite severe injuries, managed to reach the main road with 8-year-old Lucy Chen and 10-year-old Robert Adams. The 3 were discovered the following day by a territorial militia patrol and brought to Springfield, where Mary's testimony led to immediate investigation. When authorities arrived at Riverside July 22, they found Josiah Crane calmly completing his final log entry. The 4 children unable to escape during Samuel's diversion were dead, killed during what Crane's logs describe as accelerated terminal conditioning implemented after the others' escape. Crane offered no resistance and seemed genuinely confused by authorities characterizing his actions as criminal. During interrogation, he repeatedly insisted he had been implementing necessary conditioning protocols preparing children for frontier survival. His complete psychological break was evident in his continued belief territorial authorities would recognize his method's value once they understood his systematic approach. The investigation revealed the full horror. 45 children died between December 1811 and July 1812, not from disease, accident, or natural causes, but through systematic torture and murder by a man convinced cruelty was education. Evidence of correspondence with others interested in similar methods led to broader investigation exposing a network of frontier institutions where systematic child abuse was implemented under guise of preparation for adult life. Josiah Crane was executed by territorial authorities in August 1812, but the damage extended far beyond murdered children. The 3 survivors, Mary Patterson, Lucy Chen, Robert Adams, were so severely traumatized they required years of care before functioning in normal society. Mary's detailed testimony provided primary evidence convicting Crane and exposing the broader network. Riverside Children's Home was permanently closed, the building demolished in 1847. Documents discovered during 1987 renovation revealed the property had been abandoned for decades before demolition, with local residents reporting strange sounds and unexplained phenomena keeping them away. Whether these reports reflected genuine supernatural activity or psychological impact of knowing what occurred, the property remained uninhabited over 30 years after Crane's execution. The broader investigation triggered by Mary's testimony led to reforms in territorial oversight of charitable institutions and establishment of inspection protocols. But the network inspired by Crane's methods was never fully exposed, and historians document evidence of similar systematic abuse at frontier institutions well into the 1840s. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate victims to the entire concept of institutional child care on the frontier. Public trust was severely damaged, leading to increased reliance on family-based care and apprenticeship systems, often leaving orphan children with fewer protections than under the institutional system. Dr. Chen's modern analysis concluded Crane's systematic abuse represented one of the earliest documented examples of institutional child torture designed for ideological rather than personal motives. Crane was not a sadist in the conventional sense, Dr. Chen observed. He was an ideological terrorist using children as subjects in an experiment designed to create superior human beings through trauma. The systematic nature and detailed documentation suggest he viewed himself as conducting scientific research rather than committing crimes. The most disturbing aspect, according to Dr. Chen, was evidence Crane's methods were being studied and potentially implemented by others during the same period. Correspondence suggested a network of frontier educators and administrators believing systematic trauma necessary for proper child development. While most never fully investigated due to limited law enforcement resources, documented evidence suggests similar abuses occurred at institutions in at least 4 other territories. Crane's final log entry, written the morning of his arrest, provides insight into the mind of a man who systematically murdered 45 children convinced he was saving them. Program implementation concludes today with arrival of territorial representatives. 45 subjects successfully eliminated for insufficient survival capacity. 7 subjects achieved basic conditioning requirements. 3 subjects demonstrated advanced survival capacity and will provide foundation for expanded program implementation. Results confirm effectiveness of systematic conditioning protocols for frontier readiness development. Even facing execution, Crane never expressed remorse or acknowledged moral wrong. His final statement was a request his methods be studied and implemented at other institutions, believing his research had proven systematic trauma necessary for proper child development.